I'm not happy with what Putin's doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all, okay?
What media is very good at doing is taking facts to tell a non-factual story. So the way we might do that with anyone, it could be your life, it could be Trump's life, it could be Churchill's life, it could be Putin's life. And of course today we're talking about Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is a pragmatist. He's not a communist. What everyone wants to say that he's not a communist. Is he out to resurrect the old Soviet Union? No. He's rational, reasonable, can be understood, and he's someone with whom you can negotiate. You cannot negotiate with Adolf Hitlers. You cannot negotiate with crazy people. That his invasion of Russia was entirely pragmatic. It was entirely predictable. Mr. Putin has been saying this for 2 decades, that he deems Ukraine as the line in the sand, that if it is crossed, it will mean war. Welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton, and today we are discussing Vladimir Putin. This is part 2 of our series on Putin and part 4 of our series on Russia. And I'll probably conclude the series here because I'm going to move on to a series that many have requested that I do, which is on the Christian faith, a history of the church, a history of Christianity from the apostolic era to the end of the 30 Years' War, which was 1648. But today we're talking Putin. And in the last episode, what I was doing is I was really trying to set up for you how to sift through the details of a person's life and the manner in which we seek to understand it. Now, as I've explained on previous episodes of Ideas Have Consequences, media can be very good at, in fact, I think I even use building blocks in demonstrating this, and I don't have them out here, but you can imagine it quite easily. Suppose that I have building blocks across the desk here, and I have some that are black and some that are, let's say gold, representing finer moments of your life, and white ones, which are just kind of, mundane details. But the blocks collectively, they represent a timeline of your life. Now, what media is very good at doing is taking facts to tell a non-factual story. So the way we might do that with anyone, it could be your life, it could be Trump's life, it could be Churchill's life, it could be Putin's life. And of course today we're talking about Vladimir Putin, but what they might do, for instance, if they're not just out and out lying, is they can remove select blocks and then push the whole together in order to tell the story they want to tell. So, for instance, we could tell your story, someone else's story, where what we do is we highlight the blacker factual episodes, the darker episodes of your life, a divorce, or that time you were arrested for smoking pot, or, maybe some truancy as a kid, or maybe when you were arrested, or what have you. But we pull out the blocks, if that's our goal, to tell a negative story about you, to give a negative narrative. We pull out the blocks that might mitigate those things, that might help in some way to redeem you. We pull the gold blocks out. We maybe leave the white ones because the white ones are mundane information, and then we push them together, and it's black, white, black, 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 white, black, white, and that's what we do. We tell the story we want to tell. Media is very good about doing this, and again, part of what makes it clever is that they will use factual information to tell a non-factual story. Think about that. And they can also do it in reverse with somebody like a Joe Biden, for instance. They remove the black blocks and then they push the white ones and the gold ones together. Not that he really has any gold ones that I can think of, but maybe they paint a few of them of their own, and then they tell a story that makes him look, angelic, that makes him look like a great statesman. Now, of course, what they're doing to Joe Biden right now is they're in the process of jettisoning him and blaming everything on him. But that's a separate discussion for another Ideas Have Consequences. I say this to you because in sifting through and trying to understand who Vladimir Putin is, I have found it very difficult. In the last episode, I related to you 4 biographies or books that have biographical information from people who are credible, biographers or historians or Russian scholars who are trying to tell their story of who Vladimir Putin is. And the problem with Vladimir Putin, I have discovered, that comes through all of them, no matter what their ideological bent, is that Putin, and some attribute this to the fact that he was in the KGB, and they say that this is KGB training, but I don't think that's true at all, is that Putin, not by training, but by disposition, long before he was in the KGB, this seems to have been a dominating character trait of his. Putin's quiet. He reveals very little about himself. He speaks very little. And when he does, it's usually not of a personal nature. Now, almost everyone who has ever met him, long before he was in the KGB, said that this is what Vladimir Putin is like. Now, is that because he's shy? Is that because he's insecure? Or is it just simply because he's reserved? It maybe is a little of each of those things, depending on the circumstance. But Vladimir Putin isn't a guy who overshares. That's just not who he is. So what ends up happening is biographers, and you must be aware of this when you're reading about Vladimir Putin, is that biographers are left, they're reduced to kind of giving a Wikipedia-like inventory of events of his life, where you come away thinking, I still don't really know the man. There's a wonderful scene in the Oscar-winning film Patton, where George C. Scott plays General George Patton. And I don't know if this part is factual or not, but it shows one of the German generals who is trying to understand who Patton is. He assigns a member of his staff to go and do research on him. That very similar, by the way. This was kind of copied, it seems to me, in the recent Reagan film with John Voight, where John Voight plays a Russian who was sent to do research on Reagan as Reagan was, climbing the political ranks. Well, in Patton, you have this researcher who goes out and studies Patton. Everything he can gets his hands on, he studies. And then the general finally, says to him, tell me what you know. And he begins with Patton's birth date, and that Patton was in the Olympics, and that Patton married this person, and Patton is this. And he interrupts and he says, you're telling me nothing about the man. Tell me about the man. And then the researcher begins to tell a number of anecdotes that are revelatory of Patton's character, the kind of individual that he is. That's what you're looking for here. So when we're talking about Putin, I don't think it's because Putin has been able to thoroughly control the narrative and information that's out there about him. Not at all. A lot of information is out there about him. I don't think it's a product of his KGB training that there's not a lot about him. I think it's a product of his personality. Putin is not given to, at any point in his life, to oversharing. He's quiet. And we're going to come back to this because I think Vladimir Putin's rise can largely be attributed to this. I said it at the end of the previous episode in part 1 of Vladimir Putin, that Putin is a guy that I think others underestimated and all thought they could control because he didn't have a dynamic personality. He was he hid his ambition. I think he's an incredibly ambitious guy. He hid his desire for power, and he seemed loyal, a company man. And so everybody thought they could control Vladimir Putin, and they grossly, grossly underestimated him. But these biographers, the four that I mentioned in the previous episode, here, Catherine Belton, Putin's People, Masha Gessen's The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin, that's the subtitle, The Man Without a Face, and Philip Short's Putin, and then I mentioned Amy Knight's book, Orders to Kill, which again contains some biographical information. It's about his political, assassinations of his enemies. It's not good marketing for biography. So none of these biographers admit what I'm telling you. It's because it's not good marketing for a biography to say, you know what, we really just don't know much about the man. We just don't. And that's the reality here. And so the result is that they take you're reduced to looking at certain events from Putin's life and interpreting his reaction to them. Now that's helpful, and that's what we're going to do on today's program. We're going to look at a few key events in Putin's life because they do reveal something about the man. But Putin himself has not written some great memoir where he shares his deepest thoughts or his inner motivations or his loves or his hates. So we're left to read tea leaves. And in reading them, I think we can come away and learn quite a lot about him. And so I think that I'm able to present to you today something that's quite useful in understanding who he is. And in a sense, I'd like to think if I were advising the President of the United States, President Trump, what I'm telling you today is what I would say to him. And that is, right here off the bat, and I'll come back to it, Vladimir Putin is a pragmatist. I'm absolutely convinced of this. I would say, Mr. President, you need to understand you're not dealing, he's not a communist. What everyone wants to say that he's not a communist. Is he out to resurrect the old Soviet Union? No. Is he driven by Christian ideals? No. Is he a fascist? Maybe a little bit. But he's 100% a pragmatist. And because he's a pragmatist and not crazy, we dealt with that in the previous episode, crazy people are not predictable. Pragmatists are. And that's because they will act in their best interest. And in Putin's case, Putin is a patriot and a pragmatist. He does love Russia. And now, as I indicated in part one of this series, Putin has confused himself with the state. He sees the two as the same. An attack on the state is an attack on Vladimir Putin. An attack on Vladimir Putin is an attack on the state. That's the way he sees it. I'm quite confident of this. But because he's a pragmatist, Mr. President, he's rational, reasonable, can be understood, and he's someone with whom you can negotiate. You cannot negotiate with Adolf Hitlers. You cannot negotiate with crazy people because they may tell you one thing one day and do something else the next, or they may or may not act in their best interests. They may do something, completely different. But in the case of Vladimir Putin, what he's going to do has been, and I argued this last week, that his invasion of Russia was entirely pragmatic. It was entirely predictable because it was very much in keeping with Russia's policy, both in the Tsarist era and the communist era. Russia has always seen, and again, this isn't a statement about whether Russia should or shouldn't. I'm just stating to you a fact. Russia has always seen, will always see, Ukraine is absolutely vital to its survival, that it cannot survive apart from it, that it is weakened to the point of deep vulnerability without Ukraine. And with that in mind, knowing that that is the Russian mindset, and a mindset stated long before Vladimir Putin, I would say to the President of the United States, I would have said to the President of the United States prior to the 2022 invasion, Mr. President, maybe we need to rethink what we're doing here, because we are provoking Russia by our shenanigans in Ukraine, by meddling in their elections and in their politics, and Russia might invade. And here's a problem for us, Mr. President. Ukraine is a border state. The state that it borders is Russia. It is not difficult logistically for Russia to invade Ukraine. Unfortunately, Mr. President, for us, it is going to be very difficult to defend Ukraine. It is a world away. And the Russians know this and understand this. And we should take this into our calculations, because historically, the Russians view Ukraine as vital. And Mr. President, Mr. Putin has been saying this for 2 decades, that he deems Ukraine as the line in the sand, that if it is crossed, it will mean war. And again, that is because Vladimir Putin is a pragmatist. Now, we're going to come back to this in just a moment, but let's take a look at some of the events regarding Vladimir Putin, who he is. Who is this guy? Now, let's deal with the Wikipedia type information first. I say the Wikipedia. Don't give Wikipedia a click. Back when I was teaching, if a student put Wikipedia in their bibliography, that's an F. It is not the source of information. Wikipedia can be useful, though, for one thing, to go and see the bibliographies that people where they're getting their information. It can be useful for that. But anyway, let's deal with some of the facts of Putin's life. Putin was born in Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, in 1952. That means that he was born. That means he was born while Stalin was still alive. Stalin had 5 months left to live when Putin was born. So Putin didn't grow up in the Stalinist era, but he was born in it. And there would be a lingering cultural memory, both from society itself and from his parents. The fact that he was born in St. Petersburg, I see as much greater significance than do these biographers. And that is because the mentality of Leningrad, of St. Petersburg, and Moscow are very different. Very different. I can't think of a Western comparison. It's not the same as the difference between, say, New York and Los Angeles. And we would say that the difference in mentality, the difference in lifestyle is huge between Los Angeles and New York. But I can't think of an American, a Western equivalent. The mentality of St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was a city that was founded by Peter the Great, hence the name. And Peter founded it as his window on the West. St. Petersburg has always been, and it's gone through, several name iterations. It was Petrograd, which was deemed to be too German, and then it was Leningrad, and then it was St. Petersburg again. But when the Russians voted after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they took a vote, and the people of St. Petersburg voted to return to the name St. Petersburg. They wanted the name Lenin, taken out of it. But St. Petersburg is a much more Western-minded city. Now, Russia, as I've stated in part 1 of the series on Russia, is not Western. Putin himself insists that it is. I've noticed that even a couple of these biographers do the same thing. Russia is not Western. Russia straddles, and this is part of Russia's cultural problem, and the reason for its cultural schizophrenia is that Russia straddles 2 continents. It is Eurasian, and so it is pulled into different directions. Philip Short, I think at least a couple of times in the reading of his excellent biography of Putin, but on this point, I would argue with him. He argues that Russians are European. Not so. Some of them are. Some of them are Asian. I mean, Russia spans 11 time zones, and it goes all the way to the Bering Straits. Some of them are as Eastern as it gets. And the result of that has been that Russia, as I pointed out in that first episode on Russia, is that it has been drawn between westernizers, torn, I should say, between westernizers who want to make Russia much more European, much more Western, both governmentally and culturally. And there are those who want to pull it towards the East, which is more dictatorial, more Asiatic in terms of its government and in terms of its ideas regarding freedom, where there is none, regarding freedom of speech, where there really is none, and where people serve the state. So Russia has been drawn between what are called Slavophiles. We can call those kind of old traditional Russians who are drawn to the ideas of autocracy and Russian orthodoxy, and westernizers. And I pointed out in that series, if you were to just take, Russian rulers, we could go very far back, but from, say, Catherine the Great, who came to the throne in 1762, I think. She was a westernizer. She was a German. But then, she's followed by her son, Tsar Paul, who himself was not a westernizer. He was a Slavophile. So Russia goes back in that direction. And then he's followed by Catherine's grandson, who's a westernizer, goes back in that direction. Then he's followed by his half-brother, Tsar Nicholas I, the Iron Tsar, who was a Slavophile, goes back in that direction. Then he's followed by his son, Tsar Alexander II, who is a westernizer. I mean, you get the point. It's just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It is, it's a cultural schizophrenia. And Vladimir Putin was born in St. Petersburg, but in Peter the Great's window on the west. And because of that, I think that matters, because St. Petersburg and Moscow, as I've said, are very, very different, far more different than Los Angeles and New York. And Moscow is Russian to its soul and always has been. St. Petersburg has always been a mistress of the West. And the mentality in St. Petersburg has been Russian, yes, but not wholly Russian, because of its geographic proximity to the West, its interaction with the West, because of the ideological basis upon which it was founded by Peter the Great. So I think that Putin being born there, that matters. And I think Putin has seen himself as a bit of both, as a guy who wants to westernize, or at least did want to westernize Russia, but at the same time, he's a patriot. He's a Russian patriot, and he respects old Russian tradition. So again, he was born there at the end of Stalin's reign of terror. And he's a St. Petersburg man, and he was throughout much of his career until he became president of Russia. He's the youngest of three children. His father fought in World War II. His mother was a factory worker. His family life seems to have been stable. So this isn't a guy who grew up, as a product of some kind of gross abuse or neglect. His family didn't have much money, but almost no Russians did at this particular time. They grew up, fairly middle class by Russian standards at that time, sharing a kitchen with other families and such. But again, this would be seen in the United States as a sign of your poverty, not in Russia, the 1950s and the 1960s, or the 1970s or 80s. That would be, fairly standard for a number of Russian families. So again, I want to stress, it seems that he came from a fairly stable family and respected his parents and maintained relatively good relations with them. His mind wasn't warped by Marxist ideology. I reject the idea that Vladimir Putin is a communist. Nothing in the events... I'm not sure to what extent we can believe the things that Putin himself has said in public. He's a politician. They will say all kinds of things. Read my lips. No new tax. I mean, we know this. Politicians in the West, politicians in Russia, they're the same. They will say a number of things which they do not believe, which they do not plan to do. So his public statements, in many instances, I think we have to take with a grain of salt. But we look at the things that he's done. Has Vladimir Putin tried to resurrect the Soviet Union? Ideologically speaking, no. He hasn't done that. There's nothing to indicate that he's wanted to do this. Biographers have made a big deal out of the fact that he was a big fan, apparently, of Max Otto von Stierlitz. Max Otto von Stierlitz. We'll put his image up here on the screen. Stierlitz was the Soviet equivalent of James Bond. You see, James Bond is not just a figure of entertainment. Well, he is now, but at the time that he first appeared in the form of Sean Connery on the big screen, whatever the intentions of the movie makers, which of course was to make money, James Bond became a symbol of the Cold War. He became a symbol, a hero of the Western side of the Cold War. Here he was outwitting, Spectre and Smersh. He's outwitting Russians. He became a hero, a symbol of freedom, of the greatness of the West, of style, of a lifestyle. But he became an incredible symbol of the West, much the way that John Wayne was during World War II and during the Cold War, the early part of the Cold War. So much so that it's been alleged, some say that it is fact, that Joe Stalin wanted to assassinate John Wayne. What we do know for a fact is that Stalin liked John Wayne quite a lot, and he saw him as a dangerous symbol of America. That it was his movies were better propaganda, pro-American propaganda, than anything coming out of Russia at the time. Well, so was James Bond. And so the Soviets sought to copy that model and just make their own guy who was a communist and who extolled the virtues of communism and defended communism, was a man of virtue. One big change they made with Max Otto von Stierlitz was he wasn't a guy who slept around with loads of different women. Max Otto von Stierlitz was not drawn to bimbos. He was a family man. We would see, and you could probably find them on YouTube, the movies of, and there are many of them, Max Otto von Stierlitz movies, the Soviet 007, you would see them as simplistic, as naive, and probably only entertaining insofar as they're a picture of an era. And in that regard, they're highly entertaining and informative because they tell you something about the Russian mindset or what they thought was great. But Vladimir Putin and a lot of Russian boys rushed home to watch the TV shows, the movies of Max Otto von Stierlitz. And Putin later in life would meet the actor. But I think too much is made out of this because biographers, and I think all of them, I don't remember if Amy Knight mentions Max Otto von Stierlitz. I don't think so. But biographers make a big deal out of this, that Putin, as a boy, he admired Max Otto von Stierlitz and wanted to be Max Otto von Stierlitz. And guess what? he entered the KGB and became him, sort of. Why do I think too much is made out of this? I don't see this as a big biographical nugget at all. I see it as something that biographers latch onto because you can build a chapter around it very easily. But what boy doesn't? I mean, to me, that just means that Putin was just a typical kid. What boy of my generation didn't grow up wanting to be Batman or Superman or, Joe Namath or, Bruce Jenner? Oh my gosh. He used to be on Wheaties. Handsome all-American guy, but that's another conversation. What boy didn't want to be James Bond or John Wayne or Rambo or some equivalent? To me, that just means that Putin is just a typical kid. So I don't read too much into that. In his youth, Putin was, by his own admission, a street brawler and thug. That's the way he characterized himself. He was getting into fights in the streets and petty theft and this kind of stuff is what he did. And he wanted to be tough and respected. And again, biographers sometimes read into this. He's not a big man. Physically, he's not a big man. And he does seem self-conscious about this. There are a few videos that float around on social media that show him lining up for a photograph and where it's clear that his handlers have been instructed to move tall people away from him so that he doesn't look, like Emperor Hirohito standing next to Douglas MacArthur. That very famous picture of the very diminutive, I think he was like 5'4", 5'5", the Emperor of Japan standing next to the 6'4" Douglas MacArthur. It just, that one image just destroyed the idea of the divinity of the emperor. And it's some of these videos that you can find. They're not AI. It's pretty obvious that these are real, and Putin is quite uncomfortable and kind of indicating to his handlers, "Get this guy away from me. Move them away from me. This is not going to look good." So does he have, and this requires us to speculate, does he have a little bit of a Napoleon syndrome about him? Maybe. Possibly. There are signs of it. I don't know that for a fact, but it seems very possible that that's the case. What does seem to me to be real about Putin in this regard is that Putin wanted to be tough. And sometimes people who are not as tall as others do really feel the need for this. Thus, they work out a little harder. They maybe make themselves a little bit tougher because they can feel their vulnerability, and maybe they're teased about it. And sometimes that moves a guy into the direction of oddly becoming a bully. When I was coming up through school, several instances, the bullies were short guys. And I think that the two were related. It wasn't just their home environment. I think it often had to do with the fact that being very self-conscious of the fact they weren't as big as the other kids on the playground, they sought to become tough. And it seems to me to be Vladimir Putin. He poured a lot of his energy into Taekwondo. Now, this has been, when I look this up, and this is the kind of petty stuff that I see, there's a lot of things you can criticize Vladimir Putin about, and which I do. I mean, he has assassinated a number of his opponents. I mean, he has absolutely suppressed democracy, freedom impulses within his own country. He absolutely has done the same to the press. We need not go further to find other things to criticize him about unless it's true. And so when I look up things regarding Taekwondo, it'll say, oh, he's not very good, or he's this, that, and the other. According to Philip Short, he's quite good. And he's won a number of tournaments. Not now in his 70s, but when he was younger. So in his own weight class, he seems to have been a bit of a badass. He was pretty good at this kind of athletic endeavor, and he poured his energy into it because that's what he wanted to do. That's what he wanted to be. Tough, respected. And I think the issue of respect here is very important where Vladimir Putin is concerned. I'm going to say this now lest I forget to say it later. I have said that a major point regarding Vladimir Putin is that he's a pragmatist. That is correct. A pragmatist and a patriot. Those things, again, if I'm advising the President of the United States, I'd say, Mr. President, bear those in mind. He's not crazy. You can deal with him. You can talk turkey with him. He will act in the best interests of what he deems to be himself and his country. He's rational in this regard. But I would also say this. This is a man who takes any perceived slight personally. Only slight him if it's your intention to do so, because it will piss him off. Any little petty power plays like showing up late and this kind of thing, he's not going to respond well to it. Did you notice in his meeting with Tucker Carlson, and you know, this doesn't come up in the interview itself. You had to hear Carlson or someone else talking about this later. Putin left him waiting something like 3 or 4 hours. Do you think Putin didn't know that Tucker Carlson was waiting for him in the Kremlin for an interview? Do you think Putin just saw this as a minor thing on his calendar for that day? I promise you he didn't. That's a power play. Executives do crap like this to people all the time. I joke with my colleague Lawrence Fox. He does this all the time because he's late almost everywhere. Man will be late to his funeral. Putin does it to signal, I'm more important than you. And I promise you, if you do it in reverse to him, he will take it personally because he judges others by himself. He knows the reason someone would do that. So here's a guy who takes personal slights seriously. I think Trump either instinctively or has someone who has advised him that this is the case. Because if you recall the meeting with Zelensky in the White House where Zelensky is going after Putin. And I get it. You're at war with him. Of course you hate him. But Trump keeps trying to shut Zelensky down in the things he's saying regarding Putin. And then he finally says, this won't be helpful when it comes to the negotiating table. I'm paraphrasing, but Trump says something to the effect, you can't call him, an evil dictator, liar, all these things, and then pick up the phone and expect a negotiation to go well. Trump understands this about negotiations, and it's why I think media frequently, they lie, but it's why I think media frequently accuses Trump of being cozy with Putin or cozy with Kim Jong-un or someone like that, or Xi, because he's not quoted as calling them, well, he did with Kim Jong-un, calling him Rocket Man and all these kinds of things. Trump doesn't mind saying that calling Nancy Pelosi crazy Nancy, or saying that Hillary Clinton should be in jail. When it comes to world leaders with whom he has to deal with, I think Trump is of the mind, because he's negotiated his whole life, that it just isn't helpful to a negotiation if you make it personal. And if I'm advising the President of the United States, I'd say, look, it's more important that you win the negotiation than that you win the press. I know the press would love it if you came out and just had a string of insults laced with expletives about Putin. But that is not going to help us in negotiation with him. And we need to negotiate with him. We need to end this war. We need to end people dying. We need to stop the possibility of World War III. And therefore, it is my advice, Mr. President, don't make it personal, because this guy takes things personally. He really does. That's why I suggested to you, at least I think I did, maybe I was in conversation with my producer here or someone else, but I think when this war is over and the media's attention has turned to something else, in a decade or so, Zelensky will quietly, there'll be a headline stating that Zelensky has moved on to the afterlife. And Putin will have been responsible for it. He takes things personally. He takes slights personally. Hence the reason he has assassinated a number of his former associates, because it's personal for him. War, not necessarily, but friends who turned on him, or people he saw as associates who turned on him and went and ratted him out to the media or ran to the West and began spilling all kinds of information regarding him. Those people, their lives, they don't last very long. They don't. So he takes things personally. He was a mediocre student, according to those who knew him. Again, nothing spectacular here. That could be said of many of us. And again, he was very reserved and quiet, which led some to think he was stupid, which clearly he wasn't. He volunteered himself upon graduation from high school to the KGB. Now, again, this comes back to the Max von Stierlitz thing, the Max Otto von Stierlitz thing, that he wanted to be the Russian James Bond. Okay, a lot of young men do, so I don't see any great revelation in that. And he had bought into the public image. So you see, the Max Otto von Stierlitz TV shows and movies were great Soviet propaganda because it portrayed the KGB as the white knights, the sword and shield of the state, rather than what the KGB has historically been, and now its successor, the FSB, which is murderous, literally murderous, mass murderers, genocidal maniacs. But that's not the image, that's not the story that was told to the Russian people. So we hear that he tried to join the KGB, and we think, this is proof that he's a megalomaniac. No, it's proof that he's a patriot. It's proof that he wanted to be one of those white knights. He'd seen all those TV shows, and he bought the propaganda. He believed it. But they told him to go away and learn something useful and then come back, and maybe they would consider him. He did. He went away. He went to Leningrad State University, where he studied law, graduated in 1975, and then joined the KGB as a foreign intelligence officer. He married his sweetheart, Ludmila, a woman with whom he had 2 children, 2 daughters. And they divorced, I think, in 2014. And his relationship with her, even that, there's not a lot of information. Now, Ludmila is not a woman who minds talking. She seems like, trying to think of a good Western equivalent. She seems occasionally like that wife who can't shut up. But I'm sure that in private, Putin has made it very clear, so help me. If you reveal embarrassing or damaging details, I will make you pay dearly for it. And he gave her a golden parachute. But he was married to Ludmila for a very long time. And Ludmila is interesting because Ludmila came from a small town. She herself was not drawn to becoming the first lady of Russia. She wasn't drawn to power. She liked the West. They were stationed in Dresden for a period of time, which seems to have been a very happy period in their marriage. Putin liked the West. He liked Germany. He started learning German. He started learning German before he even went to Dresden. But Ludmila was fluent. And the image you get, Dresden is an out-of-the-way, during the Cold War, Dresden was not a hot spot of the Cold War. The hot spot of the Cold War, at least between Russia and, say, Britain and America, was Berlin. Both West and East Berlin. That was the hot spot. I mean, if you were CIA or KGB or MI6, that was where you wanted to go. That was the prestigious posting, not Dresden. Some have tried to make his time in Dresden seem very dramatic, that he was running agents. Maybe he was. Possibly he was. So what? That would have been his job to do that. But to me, again, it's a signal that Putin was not seen as a bright star. If he had been, they'd have sent him somewhere much sexier than Dresden. He was sent to a field office that was, occasionally things happen here. And again, to me, this is kind of the secret of Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin being always underestimated, being always the second or third or fourth guy that you would think could run the whole place or would be your choice to do it. Because, again, he was seen to be a kind of middling talent. He was never deemed incompetent. He wasn't deemed to be stupid, but he wasn't deemed to be bright. He wasn't deemed to be charming. He wasn't deemed to be that guy. He was always kind of waiting in the shadows for his opportunity. And wait, he did. So again, in Dresden comes the first event that I think is very important in shaping Putin's worldview, and that is he was in Dresden during the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall, November 9, 1989. And what ends up happening is, maybe a few weeks after that, the KGB office, there's a threat that it's going to be stormed. For those of you who maybe don't remember this, there was chaos in East Germany after the collapse of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that's because it went from a Stasi state who controlled everything, a massive surveillance state. It went from that to where the crowds, kind of like during the French Revolution, the crowds poured into the street during the day, and they controlled everything. And the former controllers were afraid of the mob. And so the story goes that a small mob, 30 or so people, decide to head to Stasi headquarters. They're gonna sack the place. But then seeing across the street from it, the KGB, and this is in Dresden, seeing across the street, the KGB headquarters, they go, why don't we go over there? And security guards get nervous. What's going to happen here? Do they shoot at them? Do they not? They're on foreign soil. And Putin comes out and tells the crowd that his soldiers, his security, that they are prepared to fire on them. But Putin is worried, and he thinks the whole place is going to get sacked. And who knows what documents or information they might get. And so he calls for support from the nearby, the nearby military outpost, Russian military outpost. And they say that decision to send you help has to come from Moscow, and Moscow is silent. Remember that phrase, Moscow is silent. Putin himself, this was a terrifying moment in his life. I don't fault Putin for this. I commend him, in fact, for saying, so help us, if you storm the building, we will open fire on you. I mean, from the standpoint of his position, that makes sense. He did not want it to become the next, Bastille, where, they stormed the castle, they stormed the fortress, and the French troops did nothing. And then the result was, they're all murdered and beheaded and this kind of thing. Putin would say later, though, that the phrase Moscow is silent was frightening because it meant that his whole world, and not just him, this was true for throughout Russian government, but throughout Russian society, the world that they had known and grown up in had crumbled overnight. Overnight. Soviet Union was already breaking up. That began in 1988. The collapse of the Berlin Wall in 89. The collapse of the Soviet Union comes in 91. It's all happening very quickly. And for Putin, going from a world where he kind of understood it, he knew it, he could interpret it, to now the chaos of a post-Soviet world was terrifying. And again, that was true for most Russians because they had no idea what the future held for them. Putin supposedly retired from the KGB in 1990. Now, again, one of the writers that I've consulted here, Amy Knight, she maintains, and not just Amy Knight, Catherine Belton, Putin's People, she argues, probably relying on Amy Knight, though I'm not sure, that Putin was a KGB man all along. This is what others, have alleged regarding him, that he was sort of a KGB, that he didn't retire in 91, that he was sort of a KGB plant, that they were assisting him all along the way to become president of Russia. I don't buy it. First of all, he wouldn't be the guy you'd choose. You wouldn't think he'd have the dynamism in order to the charisma necessary to achieve it. Second of all, as I pointed out in the last episode, at this time, the chaos in Russia, I was first in Russia in 94, and the chaos really existed. And then I'm back again in 99 during the apartment bombings. And there was a huge difference between the two. But in the early days, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was every man for himself. And the theft of Russian government was huge. And it wasn't so they could build another Russian government, resurrect the Soviet Union. It was so they could live a comfortable life in the West. That's what most of these people were doing. And I think Putin was too. Putin becomes a faculty member in St. Petersburg, part of the law faculty, and he eventually becomes deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. But again, as a guy at this stage in his life who's quite contented to work in the background. And I think that's important. Again, that's another key to Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, listen, as I indicated in the last episode, power changes us. It does. When people, it's interesting, the conversations I've had with Lawrence Fox, my colleague, we do the show WTF, which posts here. But listening to him to talk, he grew up in a famous acting family. His father's James Fox, and his uncle, played the Jackal in the film The Day of the Jackal. I think his name's Edward Fox, and he's got some cousins and grandparents and so on who are all, in that profession. So he kind of grew up in it. And it's interesting to hear him talk about the corrupting influence of wealth, and where you're surrounded by yes people and people who are prepared to meet your every need. Human beings are not designed to work that way. We're a bit like outboard motors. In fact, I'm very much reminded of this because my children were starting up a boat the other day with the motor out of the water, and I was shouting, "Shut the motor off." An outboard motor functions best under a certain measure of stress. Men are like that. People are like that. A certain measure of stress, a certain measure of pushback. But you take it out of the water, it burns up. There's an old episode of that TV show, The Twilight Zone, which is, to me, kind of modern Aesop's fables. They have a moral to them. And they're clever. And one of them is, some kind of, mafia sort who's sent to hell, and his hell is where he gets everything he wants. And on the surface of it, you think, ooh, that'd be wonderful. But it's terrible. And it's terrible because every woman he hits on immediately falls for him. He goes to the casinos and wins every single time. Rolls sixes every time. There's no challenge to anything. And it ends with him going, kind of losing his mind. Vladimir Putin was a guy who worked in the shadows, and by all accounts of people who knew him, was uncomfortable at parties. He was uncomfortable in public. He was uncomfortable in having to become, as he did have to become, a politician, going around, giving stump speeches, press conferences. He didn't like it. He liked power, and he liked exercising power, but in anonymity. Now, how do you reconcile that? Here's an interesting question for you. When I began to detect that in the various articles and biographies I was reading in preparation for this, well, you know what images kept coming to my mind? Images like these. Images of Vladimir Putin shirtless, somewhere out west, engaged in some kind of manly activity, out horseback riding or, hunting or something like this, where it's quite clear he's very comfortable being in the public eye. I mean, those are photographs taken by state photographers. That's not paparazzi doing that. No Russian paparazzi publishes things in Russia without Vladimir Putin's consent if it deals with Vladimir Putin. So Vladimir Putin had his own people. I mean, he thought he looked good. To me, it's kind of embarrassing. Vladimir Putin had his own people taking photographs of him like that and putting that stuff out there. How do you reconcile that with a guy who, by every account in the early days, wanted to exercise power in darkness? Well, I think the answer is simple. And it's found in what Lawrence was talking about, the effect of fame on people. I think he became very comfortable with it. He went from being a guy who wasn't comfortable at the party to being the guy who wanted to be the center, the life of the party. He went from being the kid who wasn't necessarily unpopular, but wasn't the popular kid, wasn't the kid that the girls wanted to date, wasn't the guy at the top of the class, wasn't the best athlete. He was forgettable. I always tell people who are giving a speech in public for the first time, let this be of comfort to you. Unless you're really good or really bad, most people are not listening to you. It can be a little depressing maybe to hear that, because what you have to say you feel is very important. But speaking in public for the first time, if you're nervous, know this. If you get up there and you just drone on, almost nobody's listening to you or will remember you. So you'll be fine. And eventually you can maybe hone your skill and get to a place where you're thinking, I want people to listen to me. I want that guy back there who slept through the last speaker to be listening to what I have to say. I want to be good. But to begin with, don't think that everyone is sitting and listening to you and sniggering and judging you. They're only doing that if you're really good, that they can't take their eye off you, or you're really bad and they can't take their eye off of you because it's a train wreck. And now they're like, whoa, what's happening here? Vladimir Putin was that forgettable guy for most of his career that no one remembered or really noticed because he wasn't terrible and he wasn't great. And therein lies Vladimir Putin's secret. Was it a planned secret? I don't think so. I don't think he was clever enough to come up with that, though he is a clever guy. I just think it's a product of his personality. But once he became president of Russia and had the power and began slowly consolidating his power and asserting himself over the Siloviki, the strongmen of Russia, the oligarchs, power started going to his head. And he said, you know what? I look good shirtless. Ladies love me. You start thinking that all the people around you who are telling you how wonderful you are saying that because they really believe you're wonderful. Or tell you how hot and sexy you are. It's because they really think you're hot and sexy. It's the Bill Belichick effect. Bill Belichick, I think, for as clever as a coach as he has been, a guy managing his own career, has bought into the lie that this woman who was 49 years younger than him thinks he's hot. Bill, your breasts are bigger than hers. I promise you she doesn't think that. Vladimir Putin has a little bit of that going on with him. He began filling his office with pictures of czars and this kind of thing, because he began seeing himself in this kind of light. He went from being a guy working in the shadows to now being a guy who wanted to be the star of the show. It worked on his ego. But that doesn't make him, as I say, any less of a pragmatist. And he is a pragmatist. Now, a few other events here that I think are important when we're talking about Vladimir Putin that we can look at and say, what was going on here? What do we find here that can tell us something about Vladimir Putin? The first is the sinking of the Kursk. Well, excuse me. I had mentioned in the previous episode when he became in rather quick succession. He went from being the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, where he worked in the shadows, to the mayor of Sobchak. Then he became the head of the FSB, which was odd because he had the highest rank he had achieved was a colonel. And usually, in fact, historically, it's always been a general. And it's usually somebody coming from the military, not from civilian life. This is part of what has made some think that he was KGB all along. But anyway, regardless, here he is. He finds himself the head of the FSB, the successor organization to the KGB. Same thing, same people, just different name. And then he's made essentially, the vice president of Russia. He was made prime minister by Yeltsin. And again, Yeltsin. And by prime minister here, you need to understand that role in Russia is different from prime minister in, say, of India or of Great Britain. It's more of a vice presidential role. Real power resides with the president of Russia. In this case, it was Yeltsin. Now, I pointed out to you that Yeltsin, it seems, appointed him to that role, one, because he didn't overshadow him. He thought he was appointing Mike Pence. I think most people did. This, again, is how Putin moved up the ranks. He was almost always underestimated. He's also seen as competent, and he was seen as loyal. And Yeltsin, who was in poor health, was looking to retire. It's like Godfather 3, where suddenly I can't remember the guy's name, but he plays the head of the Corleone family, and he says, "Every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in." The problem for dictators is seldom do they get to ride off into the sunset. They don't get what presidents do. You lose an election or you serve your 2 terms, and then boom, you get a nice pension, you build your presidential library, and you get Secret Service protection for the rest of your life. Go to a few ribbon cutting ceremonies, write your memoirs, go on the speaker circuit, and accumulate lots of money. Dictators don't get to do that. Dictators are usually dictators for life or they're killed. There isn't a long list of retired dictators. And so Yeltsin was looking to appoint someone who could protect him, because he was looking at a scenario where if he retired, depending on who followed him, his enemies might imprison him, might bring up any number of, corruption charges against him. And let me explain to you how corruption works in Russia, in Ukraine, a number of other countries, but those 2 in particular, I've witnessed it, firsthand. Those are countries where pretty much everyone is on the take. Almost everyone is on the take. And the way that works, what that looks like is this. Putin, by the standards of Russia, does not appear to have been greedy in this regard. There were efforts to give him, a yacht on one occasion, which he turned down. This is when he was deputy mayor. of St. Petersburg didn't make a big salary, give him a nice Mercedes, which he turned down. It seems that Putin did this strategically, not because he wasn't on the take, but within Russia, within Ukraine, there's a measure of graft, of what we would see as corruption, that they see as quite tolerable and doesn't necessarily mark you out as a really corrupt politician. But then there's another level from that which does. Putin didn't want to be perceived that way because he was, as I have said, incredibly ambitious. So I don't think it was for any kind of moral conviction. But secondly, because he didn't want to be owned by those people. He knew that would mean that they expected something in return. Few people give, in my experience, running a nonprofit. Few people really give. Most are buying. They expect something in return, sometimes for themselves. And Putin, being very aware of this, turned down the bigger prizes, the bigger offerings, because he didn't want to be owned by those people. He wanted to be his own man. And I would stress this about Putin. Putin has been his own man. He's not been owned by the KGB. He's not been owned by the oligarchs. He played their tune and danced to it for as long as was necessary to achieve power, and then he slowly asserted himself over all of them. That's Vladimir Putin. Crazy? I don't think so. Crazy like a fox? You betcha. And again, if I'm advising the President of the United States, I'd say, Mr. President, do not underestimate him. He's fairly quiet. He's not dynamic. He's not charismatic. He wasn't a great scholar in school. Almost certainly plagiarized his graduate thesis. Strong evidence to that effect. Whole sections of it being, it appears that he paid someone to write it for him. But don't extrapolate from that this guy's an idiot, because he isn't. And he knows how to play the game. And by the way, another myth about Putin is he's a great chess player. Doesn't play chess. But that was something that was being said early on, that Putin was some kind of grand master in chess. He's not. But I will say that he's something of a grand master in diplomacy. He does know what he's doing, but it doesn't mean he doesn't occasionally overplay his hand. And in the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, in 2014, he took Crimea. Eastern provinces, a land bridge is what he was seeking. In 2022, I think that Putin had overplayed his hand, and I think he had, because by this time Putin is believing everything that's being said about him by his own people, who are paid to say nice things about him, or they're afraid to say anything negative about him. And this is the corrupting influence of power. I don't think the younger Putin, the early President Putin, invades in 2022. This one was sure. I think his advisors were all telling him, Ukraine won't fight. They love you. Ukraine will fall like a ripe fruit into your hand, and it didn't. And it became his Vietnam or Afghanistan. So I think he overplayed his hand there. But a couple of other things here that I think is interesting regarding him. The sinking of the Kursk. I find this very significant. Now, when the Kursk went down, the Russian nuclear submarine, the pride of the Imperial Navy, when it went down in August of, I think it was August of 2001, I think? 2000, anyway. When the Kursk went down, Putin was at that time vacationing at his dacha in Crimea. I remember following this drama very closely, because at the time it was believed that this nuclear submarine, which had had some kind of catastrophic failure, we now know there was some kind of ignition of fumes inside the missile bay. and when the Kursk itself would later be raised with Western help, is a catastrophic failure. Almost everybody in the Kursk was dead it's believed, within 2 minutes. But at the time, that wasn't what was believed. What was believed was that all of these Russian sailors, many of them were still alive, and they were tapping on the hull, seeking help as the Kursk sat on the bottom. And while all that was going on, media was showing pictures of Vladimir Putin sunbathing in Crimea. It gave the impression of a guy who was out of touch and didn't care. Now, Putin would say, and I think credibly, that one, he didn't realize how serious it was because he was misinformed by his own Navy, and that they believed that the crisis was, he didn't want to give the impression to the West that this was a major crisis. Initially, it was the Norwegians, Americans, British, others offered help to try to evacuate sailors who might be alive on the Kursk, and it was reported that those offers were declined. And it is because, again, the Kursk was the most sophisticated nuclear submarine in the Imperial Navy, and thought to be, by some, the most sophisticated nuclear submarine in the world, and that the Russians did not want Western militaries, navies, to get a look at it up close. And that there was some question, yes, we don't have the technology to get down there to it, but the Norwegians, the British, and the Americans might, but they can't dock to it. And the bath escape type, little mini subs they would use to get down there to it aren't big enough, even if they could dock, to take on board dozens of sailors. So does it really even, make much sense allowing them to go down there and take a look at it anyway? Putin initially ignored the crisis until it got to such a fever pitch that he couldn't avoid it anymore. And so he went to a meeting of all the families. Now this, I think, tells us a lot about him. He went to a meeting of all the families who have, a father, son, brother, husband aboard that submarine, and these people are angry, upset, and demanding information. Admiral of the Navy comes to try to speak to him. They just maul him and others. Not physically, but it feels like it could go that direction, according to those who were there. And Putin is a guy who is quoted as saying that he believes, and this is very much like Trump, he sees himself as a deal maker. He sees himself as a guy that if he can get in front of people, he can win the day. And so he said, I'll go and speak to them. There should be no cameras inside the room. I don't want any cameras. It'll just be me and those families. And I will meet with them and I will explain to them what has happened here. And though it's hard and it's difficult, they will understand. Well, they didn't. And for 3 hours, they brutalized Putin. He never did that again. He went and he explained truthfully. The reason we can't get him out is because our Navy, I've only been your president for a very brief period of time, and my predecessors gutted the Navy because right now we're a very poor country. Soviet Union collapsed a decade ago, and we're still trying to get on our feet. We're still trying to make the transition to a new economy, and we haven't done it yet. We're not there yet. And there's been a lot of corruption. And guess what? Our Navy lacks the technology, any ability to get down to that submarine, much less raise it. And people went nuts. It's said that Putin left that meeting feeling somewhat traumatized. But I find that one of those events that's very insightful about Putin, because I don't know of any Western politician who would have gone to a meeting like that. And he did, believing he could win. Now, since then, he's not done anything like that again. Any events, town halls, and so on that Putin is in these days are carefully orchestrated and controlled, kind of like an event for Biden or Kamala, where you got all the paid people, who are there to fawn and clap at the appropriate moments and ask questions that are plants. But that wasn't the case with the Kursk. The next event that I think tells us an awful lot about Vladimir Putin was, again, in the first couple of years of his presidency. He won. He succeeded Yeltsin. Yeltsin retired, appointed him, resigned. He appointed Putin as acting president, and that made it difficult for Putin to lose because he was an incumbent. Putin wins in 2000. He gets 53% of the vote. He becomes president, and now he is serving, he was serving a 4-year term. Those terms would be extended to 6-year terms. And you can only serve 2. Now he's in his 5th now because they changed the Constitution. Now that's power. That tells you about Putin. But at this point, early in his career, you have the Moscow hostage crisis, theater hostage crisis, because this is the war in Chechnya. Chechens gain control. They storm the theater, come out on stage firing weapons during the middle of the play. Some thought that it was, it was all part of the production. Then they quickly realized that it wasn't, and they take everyone inside the theater hostage, and they begin making demands. And these Chechens, their demands was that the war in Chechnya end and that Russian troops be withdrawn immediately. What happens? FSB, Spetsnaz units. Spetsnaz. We don't have any equivalent to that. You may say, well, aren't they like our airborne Rangers or our Navy SEALs or Delta? No. They're that, and they're kind of like the SS, Assassination Squad. They show up at the theater, and we're talking about roughly 200 hostages. They show up and they pump gas into the theater. Gas, we now know, was some kind of fentanyl derivative. The result is that people begin passing out. But it's more than that. People began dying in their own vomit. Spetsnaz storms the theater at that point where everyone is knocked out cold, and they go around executing all the terrorists, shooting them in the head as they go. And then they brought the hostages out and stacked them like Lincoln logs on the sidewalk in front of the theater. Because the local police, because the local hospitals were not given any knowledge of the poison, of the gas that was used, they were not prepared to offer any kind of emergency care to the people who were, to the hostages who are now being brought out of the theater. The result was, again, that many of them choked on their vomit. They're laid on their backs. And in a situation like that, these people becoming sick and vomiting, they choke and suffocate on their own vomit. But also it meant the hospital had no ability to give any kind of, counteracting drugs because they didn't know, and when asked, were denied knowing what kind of gas was used. So the result was that the death toll went incredibly high. Most of these people died. Did Putin have a big mea culpa? No. Putin's approach was to say, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Okay, I get that. But this was a pretty murderous, this was a ruthless response to a terrorist attack. And the same thing would happen in Beslan in, I think, 2004, which you can look that up. I won't go into those details now, but it's, again, very similar. It was a school hostage crisis. Again, Chechens involved, and the whole school blew up and caught on fire. And some think that it's because the Chechens blew it up, but others suggest, some of these here, they suggest that it was actually because the Russian military opened fire on the school. Anyway, the result was, again, 200-300 people dead. And Putin's response, we do not negotiate with terrorists. Again, a government that negotiates with terrorists will always be a hostage to terrorists. I understand that. I think most reasonable people do understand that. but a little more effort at negotiation, at trying to save the lives of the hostages themselves. I think most of us would like to see that in situations of this sort. You know, something like the Israeli response to, the hijacking at Entebbe, where they saved the hostages. This is not what happened. So this is insightful to Putin because it tells us that Putin himself is ruthless. And then just a couple of other points before we close out this episode of Ideas Have Consequences. Putin, coming back to the fact that he's from Leningrad, I believe that Vladimir Putin very much wanted to be accepted personally, as well as his country, into the West, into the community of free nations. I think Putin wanted to become part of the cool kids club. I think he wanted his country to be respected. And he made it very clear to successive U.S. presidents, if you seek to treat us the way you want to treat, say, Lithuania or Belarus, or you want to negotiate with us the way you would, say, Sweden or Norway, you're not talking realistic. We're a superpower. We're a nuclear power. And we expect to be treated that way. And the response of the West, successive governments, again and again, was essentially, and again, I'm very much oversimplifying here just to communicate a point, was, we really don't respect you. You really aren't. Okay, you got nukes, but, let's face it. Your country is backward and economically backward and corrupt, all of which is true. And we don't fear your military anymore. This is not true. And so Putin was looking for an opportunity to flex. And Ukraine became the opportunity for it. Much as, by the way, JFK said, we need a place to show our power. Vietnam is it. Boy, that was a fateful decision. So Vladimir Putin, I think, is a guy that very much wanted to be accepted into the West, wanted his country to be accepted in the West, wanted to be respected, and when he wasn't respected, decided, if you will not respect me as an ally, I will force you to respect me as an enemy. And he has. He has. Other things about him. I think Vladimir Putin loves his daughters. He keeps them out of the limelight. He keeps almost everything about himself out of the limelight. One of his daughters had a Insta-Twitface account, quickly deleted. And I'm sure it's because her dad said, get off of there. I don't want that information on there. Stop tweeting pictures of yourself out shopping and pictures of your food. Stop it. And the account was quickly deleted. I think Vladimir Putin is a guy who does not, even though he's a Leningrader, even though he's from St. Petersburg, even though he's more Western than many Russians in terms of his mindset, he's still not really Western. His ideas of freedom are not the same as the West. He has stated quite openly that he doesn't believe in freedom of speech. When asked about his views on it, he says, I don't accept it. What do you mean freedom of speech? And Putin likes to point out the hypocrisy of the West because whenever others try to hold him to those standards, he just points out and says, your own governments are suppressing your speech in the West, so how dare you question me? All the tech giants are suppressing you and your own government. In Britain, they're arresting you for memes. So what do you mean? Trying to act all high and mighty with me. Virtuous about free speech. You guys don't exercise it either. He's got a point. He's got a point. Vladimir Putin is a man that, in my opinion, pragmatist that he is, deal maker that at least at one time in his life that he sought to be, and someone who early in his presidency, I really think he believed that Russia and the West could coexist and more than coexist, could be partners. He was the first guy to call George W. Bush after 9/11 against the advice of his own advisors who said, take a wait and see. Let's see what's going on here. He immediately called George W. Bush to say that Russia expressed its support and to express his horror at what had happened. I think it was genuine. But Vladimir Putin is also a chameleon. He is a guy who, as a politician, he's learned he's quite good at it. And he's able to reflect, as many politicians do, what their audiences want, to mirror what their audiences want. You want a guy who's pro-free speech? I can mirror that to the audience. You want a guy who's a patriot? I can mirror that to an audience. You want a guy who talks tough against terrorists? I can mirror that to the audience. And one of the stories oft circulated about Vladimir Putin is how he did it to George W. Bush, the president that it is said that he had the best relations with. George W. Bush, early on at least, certainly seemed to like him a lot and voiced it publicly. Putin had been briefed by his own people that George W. Bush was an evangelical Christian. You can argue whether he is or isn't, not my point. But Putin had been briefed that he took his Christian faith seriously. So when he and Bush met, Putin tells him this very moving story of a cross that he's wearing. And he tells him that it came from his grandmother or some such thing, and that he never takes it off. He now keeps it with him all the time. And that when his dacha burned to the ground, again, a moving story, sifting through all the wreckage and everything had been destroyed, but that they found this cross. It had endured. And now I wear it close to my heart all the time. George W. Bush lapped that up. He loved that story and began saying Vladimir Putin is a serious Christian. This is who he is. This is what he's driven by. Condoleezza Rice was horrified because she's thinking, no, he's not. Vladimir Putin, in the absence of a communist system and state, realized that Russia was ideologically adrift and that it needed a new ethic, ethos. And he decided that they would find it in the old czarist ideals of autocracy and orthodoxy. So now he pays homage to a lot of Christian talk. But my definition of what it is to be a Christian is maybe different than yours, but I stick to the biblical one. And the biblical one is, confessing with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. It means a transformation on the inside. It's more than just an intellectual adherence that, Jesus is the Son of God or that he rose from the dead. It's more than ritual. And I think that Putin has worked the ritual really effectively for the Russian people to show that he's a pious man, that he believes these things, that he's not an old Russian. And finally, one other thing. And there's so much more that I could say here, but won't. Another thing that I believe really gives me insight into Vladimir Putin was, in order to punish the West, after an event that upset him, he took it out on the American people in particular by ending Russian adoptions. Now, having adopted a daughter from Ukraine, boy, I can feel this because it's pretty sinister. What he did was he didn't simply say that Americans can no longer adopt Russian children. He did it even to those children who were midstream, meaning that there were children who believed, who had been told, you have a home, this family is adopting you. But you see, the adoption process is a lengthy process. It's about a year from beginning to end, and that's because they're bleeding you for bribes the entire way. And every little child in these orphanages, they long for parents. They long to be adopted. I'm trying to imagine my own daughter being told you're being adopted, and then months, weeks, days before the adoption being told, nope, you're staying right here in the orphanage. Can you imagine how soul-crushing that is for a child? Meaning he didn't just stop children from being adopted by the U.S., which was bad enough, by people in the United States. He did it. There were appeals to him to say, Mr. President, can you at least let those children who are already in the pipeline, they've already been told they have parents, can you at least allow those children to be adopted? And he said no. Now that to me says something about Vladimir Putin. And it's not good. So in conclusion, let me say this. I think Vladimir Putin is a pragmatist. I think he's someone with whom we can negotiate. I think he's corrupt, but name me a politician who isn't. I think he's ruthless. I don't think he's a habitual liar. One of his biographers, in fact, I may even have the quotation right here, says of Putin, when it comes to lying, he says that he is, where is it? Anyway, he says that he's not a habitual liar. He's a guy who lies only when he feels that he has to, which I think, here it is Philip Short who says this. He says that Putin is like most people in that he's a pragmatic liar. Again, a pragmatist, as I argue. Lying only when telling the truth is uncomfortable. Joe Biden is a pathological liar. Obama, pathological liar. Putin, again, pragmatic liar, meaning, as Philip Short says, he lies as most people do when it's hard to tell the truth. And it's just easier to lie about it. I think he's a very dangerous man. I think he's overplayed his hand because power has corrupted him more than he was when he started out. And I think that he's backed into a corner because he's in an existential war in Ukraine. And that makes him even more dangerous. It's why this war needs to end, because we're on the verge of a third world war. And that's my take on Vladimir Putin. There's much more I could say regarding this. You can drop your comments on YouTube and on X, and I'll do my best to answer them as it relates to Vladimir Putin. From this, we're going to move on to a couple of other subjects that I think are very pressing and important and that I believe will interest you. Please like, retweet, repost, share, and tell other people about Ideas Have Consequences, and join the posse. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.